Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 30th video in our Master Series and the 17th video in our editing phase. This is also the final video in our editing phase before we get into first phase processing. If you've taken everything I've talked about into consideration, that you should have dealt with most pertinent issues and most issues of concern when you need to edit a piece of audio. You may run into some other things that you feel you want to do in your editing phase, and you may run into some situations where you might have some situational type of editing that you have to do that you don't just have to deal with. You know, when you run into things, sometimes you just will. So if once we've gotten to this point that we basically, the first thing we want to do, we're just cleaning up. We want to get cleaned up and get out of the editing phase. So we want to make sure, go through and really scrutinize the piece of audio well to make sure there's no clicks, pops, other anomalies that we've caused from the editing that we've done, or that it wasn't done as well as we thought that we did, and we might have to go revisit some things, and things that we might have missed, and just to go through and just make sure that everything's done and done well, and we're signing off on it. And then when we get done with that, we want to make sure that we get things normalized and set under clipping. It's really important that your loudest parts of your performance are set as loud as possible under clipping. That way they're as loud as possible, and the softest parts of the performance are as loud as possible to retain as much harmonic content as possible. And we've talked about that and the importance of that. After we get done doing that, we basically want to clean up dead space. This is a huge topic because at this point, when you're done editing, if you clean up dead space, it can seriously help reduce CPU usage and disk usage, and sometimes the cache usage also, because that can cause issues later when you've got a lot of tracks you're processing or mixing and things like that, that you've got a lot more. It's going to process that dead space, and so you want to get rid of it to eliminate that issue. I mean, you're going to have enough space that has audio on it without having dead space that you're trying to process and mix that's going to take up disk space and CPU usage. So you want to clean it up really well. Go through there and bounce and merge events as needed to clean up the editing process. You can cut things or drag the ends around and, kind of just clean it up to where you've got a nice, clean looking, amount of sessions, so that, the dead space, you can get in there and get really close, like down to here if you want. I mean, but sometimes it doesn't have to be that close. Sometimes I'll leave a little bit of space. That's not that much in time. So I'll normally go out and I get in pretty good. But sometimes I'm not that worried about it being that tight, because I could go in here and clean this stuff up a lot. But I left some things, and that's pretty, small amounts of space to be worrying about. But you just kind of got to, go through it. I normally go through when it's about like this, and then I start cutting where I think there's dead space that I can cut out, that it's to cut down on the usage there. And, you really want to make sure that your parts that you edited, like that you've got two parts that are part of a phrase or something, that they're bounced together, that they're not two separate pieces of audio, that they're one piece of audio. And you really want to make sure that you've done that and done a good job of it, so that they're, you're not having, two or three pieces of audio going on a phrase or something like that, unless later on that you really think that you're doing that for some reason, because you've got question about whether or not you're going to be doing some other adjusting later, and well, no, I might fuss that later on, I'll have to recut it or something like that. But normally, no, I'll go back and recut things if I need to. I want it cleaned up and look like it's just cleaned up just like that and good to go. So once you get done with that and you've got it cleaned up really well, you really want to make sure to go through and put fades on your ends of your vents, and so auto fades normally, and then check them for clicks and pops. So, I mean, I don't know about in your DAW, but in my DAW, I just select all of them, and I've got a macro that will just put auto fades on all of them. And then I'll go through and listen to the beginning and end of each one of these events to make sure I got no clicks and pops. And sometimes you might have to go in there, get down there and adjust that fade at the end of it or at the beginning of it, because you might end up having some kind of click, or it might be causing some kind of issue, and adjust it and make sure there isn't any. So it's a really good practice to get into doing and to make sure that it is done now. So after that, we basically, we've basically cleaned up everything and we've checked everything. And about the only thing we want to do now is we want to just kind of review everything we've done, make sure we've not missed anything in the editing process, and go back and check and make sure that things are bounced and merged like we talked about, and normalized like we talked about, under clipping. And we want to go back and make sure all our track settings, you have like the track, stereo, monitor, inputs, outputs, all that kind of stuff. This is called an inspector in my DAW, and there are things related to this track. And you want to make sure you go through there. Your pannings and your volume levels should be set at 0. And anything else that might be in there that's related to that track, that it's set correctly. And that can be really dependent on your DAW. But no, most of the time it's real basic things. Unless something accidentally got put on, that you're dealing with some basic things of your volume level be set to 0, your panning and things like that, making sure that it's not on record and that's set, muting the track, things like that. And you might have some kind of a time stretch mode that you need to set, and there might be other things on your DAW that you need to check, but it's a good idea to go through and check them now. And then most of the time, I don't know if your DAW has pack folders, but I'll put it in a folder. So mine DAW has these pack folders. I'll put it in a folder. That way that track goes in its own separate folder, so that every instrument or group of instruments that I may be doubling tracks or doing whatever with, that they're in their own set folders. And then I'll go into my mixing board, or in my mixing console view, and I'll create a bus for it. So I'll go in there and add a bus for that track, make sure that track's routed to that bus, and that bus is routed to my main bus or the main out or whatever you have set up. Normally my routing is pretty simple at this point, and I'm running from my track to a bus for it, to a leveling bus, and then to a main bus that everything goes to before it goes to the main out, just in case I got to fuss with something, that I've got one last fail safe at the very end of my processing chain in my buses. And just make sure that's all set up and good to go. Once you have that all set up and good to go, you should be cleaned up pretty well. Just make sure that you don't have anything selected. I've run into a couple of issues when I be fussing around that I have something selected. One of these events is selected or something, and I get done and I start going off and I close it and I've got everything set up and go off to another track and I start trying to do some editing. Well, it's editing this track while I'm editing that track at the same time. So you want to make sure that's not selected and to make sure it's deselected. Other than that basically you should have a well-edited piece of audio that's ready to go for your first phase processing. So I really hope you enjoyed this editing phase in our master series, and I certainly hope that I made it fairly clear of the importance of the things that I was speaking of, and spoke of most pertinent things that you're probably going to have to deal with and make adjustments on or repair, and that you can do yourself a really good editing phase, make yourself up a really good notebook for doing it that can be a work in progress, that you will change and adjust as you become a better engineer and kind of get into your own workflow. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this editing phase, and I'll see you in the next video when we start our first phase processing.